Hello and welcome to the second episode of Hammer Time with me, Ralph Schoellhammer, your host. Before I begin today's show, and oh my, we have a lot of hammers to get to, I would like to express my sincerest thank you to all of the viewers and listeners who tuned into the first episode. And I'm very, very grateful for all the encouraging words. I know podcasts, there are like billions out there now, so you might still wonder why you should listen to this one, and I still hope that I can give you more and more reasons in the weeks and the months to come. So today I want to talk about a couple of issues. Of course, we will begin with Donald Trump, the assassination attempt. We'll talk about the Republican National Convention, but I also want to tie it once again together with the bigger picture about what's going on in the West and what ails the West, because I believe, especially when we talk about the so-called Trump derangement syndrome, that there are areas and reasons for this that are being overlooked. And I kind of want to take a deeper dive into this. And I'm again looking forward to your comments, to your remarks, and what you think about my theories, and what you would like me to talk about more, and why do you think I'm wrong. I'm very happy also to react to criticism because at the end of the day, I'm doing this for you and not for me. So thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again for being a listener, for being a viewer, and I hope that I will not disappoint. I want to begin today's show with probably one of the most epic moments that have ever been captured on camera. And that is, of course, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and his reaction to it.
Let me get my shoes.
I got you, sir.
Let me get my shoes, sir.
Hold that in your head. It's bloody.
So we gotta move to the bus. Let me get my shoes.
Okay, my shoes, guys. My shoes.
Watch out.
Wait.
Let me get my shoes. I'm not yet in the business of selling t-shirts, but I think I have to start printing that slogan, that sentence on them and trying to get onto the market for selling it. Now, what makes this scene, I think, so powerful is because it ends a myth about Donald Trump, that he's a coward, that he's just a bully who's really good in dishing it out, but is very, very bad in accepting if something happens to him. I think what we see here is a man that intuitively both grasps the seriousness of the situation, but also intuitively, I think, has an almost heroic reaction to what was going on. Now, I want to be very clear here. Generally, I'm always opposed to any kind of personality cult. I'm not a believer that politicians should be our role models. I think politicians should be, as Ben Shapiro likes to say, they should be like our plumbers, right? There are problems, and whatever is within their powers to solve, they shall solve, but otherwise, they shall leave people alone to go about their business. But at the same time, we do live in somewhat of a post-heroic age, right? We live in what some call a period of narcissism, that there is an epidemic of narcissism, as some psychologists like Jonathan Haidt or Christopher Lasch have talked about quite extensively in their publications. So this reaction by Trump, which apparently for him it was not the most important thing to get himself to safety, but to push out his fist and say, no, wait, and then say, fight, while the crowd erupts to chants of USA, USA, USA. That has a heroic quality. It is literally like out of a movie. So I have almost some understanding for those who are in disbelief, claiming that this must have been staged, that this must have been, something created by the Republicans to push their candidate, because it's almost so picture perfect. But of course, if we look at the evidence, it isn't, right? This really happened, and this really was Trump's reaction to this incident. And in many ways, this resembles the kind of person you would like to see as the commander-in-chief, right? Somebody who shows resolve, defiance under such threatening conditions. And this is an important element also when we look about how Donald Trump might comport himself as the president, as he did also in the past. There is another clip I would like to play, which talks about how Trump behaved as the commander-in-chief when he was negotiating with the Taliban, because I think we see glimpses here about his attitude that was also reflected in his reaction to the assassination attempt.
This is my number one favorite of all time. When we were negotiating with the Taliban, while President Trump was still the president, President Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but he wanted a conditions-based withdrawal, meaning that you do what we tell you to do, and then we will start pulling troops back slowly as long as you abide by our rules. It's President Trump and Mike Pompeo, and they are talking to Taliban leadership in the room, and they had one translator in the room. President Trump looked at the Taliban leader and said this: I want to leave Afghanistan, but it's going to be a conditions-based withdrawal. And translator translated. And he said, if you harm a hair on a single American, I'm going to kill you. And the translator goes, and Trump goes, tell him.
Yes.
Tell him what I said.
Tell him what I said. Reached in his pocket, pulled out a satellite photo of the leader of the Taliban's home and handed it to him.
Shut up.
Got up and walked out the room.
Again, if you put together that anecdote and Trump's reaction just a couple of days ago, I mean, it gives him the status. It makes him look like exactly the kind of person you would like to see as the commander-in-chief. But it also tells you something else when we look at this anecdote about him negotiating with the Taliban, which is that there is another myth about Donald Trump out there. And that myth is that he sympathizes with the autocrats of the world, that he's good friends with Vladimir Putin, that he admires the dictators around the globe. But I think there is a misunderstanding here, which is there's a difference between understanding something and approving of something. So I believe that intuitively, probably also due to his experiences as a real estate developer in New York, I think Donald Trump grasps kind of how these people tick, how these people work, which allows him to be a successful negotiator with them. I think we saw this also with Saudi Arabia. I think we saw it in the Middle East. We saw it with his decision to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that's, I think, the big misunderstanding between Donald Trump and his detractors, that many on the left believe that in the end, we are all the same. And there is us and those who don't understand us because we haven't hugged them tightly enough, right? This idea that the Taliban ultimately are just, they just give them some development aid and Afghanistan will turn into Denmark. There was, some of you might remember, when the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, was killed, the Washington Post ran this absurd headline that said, austere scholar died at the age of, I think it was 52 or whatever his age was. Again, it was this almost positive outlook towards the leader of one of the world's most horrible and terrible terrorist organizations. But that is underlying a lot of what's going on the political left, that despite them talking so much about diversity, deep down they also claim that we're all the same. And I think this is, again, something that Donald Trump understood better than others. That he says, you don't have to be a fan of Putin. You don't have to be a friend of the Taliban. But you have to understand how they think in order to successfully negotiate with them. I think the same is true in his relations to Xi Jinping and with China. And this is one of the things that we have to keep in mind, that a lot of the things that are being said about Donald Trump simply turned out, A, to be not true, or to be B, a complete mischaracterization. Nonetheless, that being said, there is something that leaves a little bit of an aftertaste if we look at what unfolded and which almost cost Donald Trump his life. Now, let's take a quick look at the behavior and the way the Secret Service reacted to the events of last week. Now, before I go into some of the open questions regarding the assassination attempt, what these pictures, for those who can't see it, it was the Secret Service trying to get Donald Trump into a car and get him to safety. But if you take a look at these pictures, at these videos, it almost seems as if the Secret Service is more afraid than Donald Trump himself. The most composed individual in this entire scene is, in fact, Donald Trump. Now, I don't want to pile on, because many others have already done it on social media and elsewhere, on this idea that maybe some DEI hiring procedures at the Secret Service are responsible for this. But let's just say that these claims are not entirely unfounded. Now, if you look, as Christopher Rufo has done, who does fantastic work in this regard, if you look at kind of the hiring practices that were installed at the Secret Service, and you have this idea that there should be more people with disabilities in the Secret Service, there should be a high quota of women in the Secret Service. I mean, the idea to use the very office, the very institution is designed to protect the most important leader of the free world, if you want, of the country, and you want to use this to pursue ideological goals that have nothing to do with what this office, what this institution was originally designed to do, that is a problem. So this is not just a right-wing talking point, this is a serious issue. And we saw this, at least if we look at the videos, we saw this happening there as well. The idea that somebody who's shorter, physically weaker than you are is the right person to protect you in the kind of scenarios that can unfold as they did is, I think, laughable and should not be taken seriously. And we saw also at the Republican National Convention, if you look at the new security detail of Donald Trump, it's all men now, it's a completely different setup. Now, another thing I want to talk about a little bit is, and I'm sure that more information will trickle in the coming weeks, and hopefully we'll find more about the assassin himself. But there are some things that, let's put it this way, allow for a question mark. This is the thing, not every question is being asked is automatically the beginning of a conspiracy theory, but if things are odd, I think it is just fair that we point at it. One thing, for example, that we saw is this idea that apparently the FBI cannot hack into the cell phone of the assassin. Yet at the same time, they claim that he most definitely acted alone. Now, as Elon Musk, I think justifiably asked on Twitter, well, if you can't get into his cell phone, how do you know that he acted alone? I think that is a very justified question. Another point that I find remarkable is that apparently this young man did not have any activity on his social media profile. So again, this is something that strikes me as very remarkable because he's also described as somebody who enjoys video games and who in other areas kind of shows a profile of a person who would, at least we would assume, somebody who is active on social media. So there are some things that on a first glance don't seem to add up. As I said, I don't want to jump to any conclusions here. I also don't think necessarily there is anything nefarious going on in the background, but we should keep an eye out on what's going on here, on the details that are still coming in. That being said, however, because I believe, and this is why I played the scene of Donald Trump at the beginning of today's show, ultimately it probably will not even make such a big difference who was responsible or whether there were more people involved. We also know now that explosive devices or potentially explosive material was found in the car of the assassin or the wannabe assassin. But I think what we saw, again, was the reaction of Trump. It was the picture of a man, or the measure of a man who reacted in a deadly situation in a way I believe all of us hope we would react as well. He kept his calm, he kept his cool, he kept his discipline. You could also say he kind of remained on message, right? Particularly the final scenes of people chanting USA, USA. I think incredibly, incredibly powerful videos, incredibly powerful pictures. And they identified Donald Trump as the patriot I believe that he truly is. Now, that being said, of course, one person did die, and I think it's also important at this point in time to send out our thoughts and prayers to the family. I think that the governor of Pennsylvania, Ian Shapiro, did a wonderful job in talking about Mr. Courtney Campero, which I think was really crucial because there was an individual that was ripped out of a family's life and is going to leave a hole that can never be filled again. Somebody who was very excited to go to a Trump rally, a supporter of Trump, a firefighter, an active member of the community, somebody that leaves behind a hole in his family that is never to be filled again. So I think this is also something we shall keep in mind, that somebody did die that day. So somebody was in fact assassinated, and that should not be forgotten. That being said, I think we have to go back to the point of what Donald Trump truly embodies. And so I want to come to another myth that I think has been mistakenly permeated through most of the media that we also have to talk about in greater detail in a second, which is that Donald Trump is not a radical. Now, if you look at the current platform of the Republican Party, none of their positions are particularly radical. Donald Trump is not a radical on abortion, contrary to what the Democrats might claim. Donald Trump is not a radical either in free market approaches, nor is he a radical in the reformation of, for example, of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So in fact, I would argue that under Donald Trump, in many areas, the Republican Party is moderated and not become more radicalized. Now, you might wonder, then why is it that the media all over the globe, right, not just in the United States, in Europe as well, is constantly claiming how Donald Trump has shifted the Republican Party further to the right, has made it a more radical party? Well, how about this thought experiment? Maybe it's everybody else who moved to the left, now of course sees a centrist like Donald Trump as a radical person. There has been this weird argument that Joe Biden is a centrist, whereas Donald Trump is a radical. Now, you can make the claim that Joe Biden is a centrist. He's a centrist in the sense that he's always in the middle of his party. But the entire Democrat Party moved significantly to the left. And as you could see recently, of course, so did Joe Biden. Now, let me develop this argument a little bit further. What is the best way? How do we know whether somebody is radical or not? And I think the best way to figure this out is to look at the position of the person in question, or to look at the positions of the party in question. Now, if we look at some of the prescriptions, some of the ideas that we find within the Republican Party under Donald Trump and the Democrat Party under Joe Biden, I think it becomes increasingly clear who the actual radicals are. I give you a few examples. Whatever you think about the idea of pride progress and the LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign community, it is well known by now that many of their positions are indeed radical. Right? If we look at the idea of puberty blockers for minors, surgery for minors, the idea that parents should not be informed if their kids want to enter into a phase of transition. So these are all very radical positions. But these are not positions that come from the right, right? The position of the right is that you might want to hold off on these things, right? You say, okay, if somebody thinks that they are transgender, you might want to give them psychological help first, or at least you want to have some time between the self-identification as being non-binary and the actual medical procedure to what is very often called, quote-unquote, transgender care. So the radical position is to immediately take somebody, put them on an operating table, and either cut off their breasts or cut off their genitals. That strikes me as the radical position. The position to say, wait a moment, maybe we should hold off on the medical procedure and make sure that the person is both mentally but also otherwise capable of making that decision and really wants it. I think that strikes me as the truly moderate position. The same is true, I think, if you look at the area, let's say, energy policy. The United States are a powerful nation that is literally swimming on a sea of hydrocarbons. One of the reasons why the United States have not yet fallen into a full recession is because of the shale revolution. The idea that energy independence is an asset to the United States is something that people like Trump and his party fully endorse. It is the idea to say we have to shut down all oil, gas, and coal production in the United States and run our entire economy on wind and solar, which is the radical position, which is the same position, for example, that the German government currently is pursuing, and everybody who follows politics in Europe knows that it has been a disaster for the German people and the German economy. Germany is deindustrializing because you cannot run a factory, you cannot run high energy industries if you make it impossible for your factories, for your smelters, for your resource needs to get the things that you need in your own country because government policy is undermining it on every turn. So we really have to ask the question also in the matter of migration. Which one is the radical position? Is migration that says we would like to have people that come to our country be vetted first, that we take a look on whether or not these people are a drag on the social system or if they're net contributors to the system, and we want to see if they culturally fit into the broader society? Or is the radical position to say we should throw open the borders and everybody who wants to come has a right to come? Now, once again, which one of those two positions is taken by the Democratic Party and which one of those two positions is taken by the Republican Party? By the way, the same is true in Europe as well. And as I always say for this show, right, I want to kind of tie together the issues that are important both in Europe and the broader West and the United States, because it is the same thing. And if you take a closer look, I would make the claim that, in fact, we have been governed for the last 30 years, if you want, in Europe at least. I think the United States are a little bit different. We have been governed by radicals, and it is the moderates that are trying to stage, if you want, a populist revolution. Because it's not just the labels that matter, it's the actual programs that you have to take a look at. And nothing that these so-called right-wing populists are trying to achieve would strike anybody as radical who was around, let's say, in the 1970s, in the 1980s. Right? Their positions on migration, their positions on the economy, their positions on the environment, none of this is radical. We are constantly told that all these positions are wildly radical, that they're wildly out of touch, but it's the exact opposite that's going on. Now, this brings me, of course, to another important question, which is Donald Trump's pick as his vice president. Now, I saw on the internet, I saw on social media, that many of the supporters of Donald Trump are very happy with JD Vance as his choice. Now, I want to say immediately, I have great sympathies for Mr. Vance. I was a huge fan of his book, Hillbilly Elegy. I lived myself, full disclosure, in Ohio and Kentucky, so I sympathize even more with the personal history of Mr. Vance. I think he's an incredibly smart individual. I think he's definitely one of the high Q conservatives that are currently around in the political debate and the political discourse. But there are also some smaller issues with him. So for once, despite him being a very, very smart individual, he was once quite the critic of Donald Trump, as this clip from Reuters, for example, shows. Now, for those who are not watching the show, let me read it to you. 8 years ago, in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, JD Vance was a bitter critic of Donald Trump. Publicly, he called the Republican presidential candidate an idiot and said he was reprehensible. Privately, he compared him to Adolf Hitler. But by the time the former president tapped Vance to be his running mate on Monday, the Ohio native has become one of Trump's most ardent defenders, standing by his side even when other high-profile Republicans declined to do so. Now, let me be clear here. I think in a good public debate, it is absolutely essential that one can change their opinion. And I think there have been many in 2016 who were against Donald Trump and have changed their opinion along the way. So this is also true for JD Vance, and I think this is fine. I think also that his approach of being not kind of an ideologically tied down as, let's say, a never-Trumper, but showing a certain pragmatism is also a good idea and makes him a strong candidate. My bigger problem with him is that I'm not entirely sure if he will have a good impact on the necessary votes for the Electoral College. JD Vance is from Ohio. JD Vance is the junior senator from Ohio, so most certainly Ohio will remain solidly red. But that probably would have happened without him being the vice president as well. I believe that given the events of the last couple of days, also the debate with Joe Biden, that in fact Donald Trump had a chance to conquer, if you want to use that expression, more than 40 states and win in a landslide. But I think in order to do so, he could have picked a better vice presidential candidate. Now, we will see. With JD Vance, I'm sure that the debate with Kamala Harris is going to be very interesting. Again, I hear that everybody is expecting him to turn it into a bloodbath, rhetorically, if you will. But let's see how this all is going to turn out, because he also provides the Democrats with ammunition. Don't forget, if I'm a Democrat, I can say now, listen, you always accuse us of calling Donald Trump the new Hitler, but at the same time, you pick a vice presidential candidate who did exactly the same thing just 8 years ago. My personal favorites would have been somebody like John James from Michigan, right? An Army vet, like JD Vance, somebody who I believe would have helped Donald Trump in solidifying the new approval and new popularity he has among the black population. I think this would have been an interesting choice, because what we see happening in the United States is a realignment in the voting population. We see this, I talked about this in my first show, which you can check out on YouTube and elsewhere, that particularly the younger black population no longer feels as loyal to the Democratic Party as the older generation. So I think there really is an opening for the Republican Party, for Donald Trump, to make additional gains. We saw after the assassination attempt at a concert of the rapper 50 Cent that he used Donald Trump's face kind of put on 50 Cent's body. So that popularity is there. So I think if he would have picked an African-American, a conservative African-American running mate, that he could have solidified that vote as well. Now, some of you mentioned in the comments recently that, well, wouldn't that mean that then the Republicans are playing identity politics? And yes, you're correct. Of course it is. But at some point, I think we have to accept the fact that when it comes to politics, it's also about power. And I believe, as much as I despise identity politics, at the moment, for now, they're part of the game. So one of the things that we have to distinguish between the left and the right is it's not enough just to be in office, as the right sometimes is. It's also important to be in power, as the left almost always is. So for a certain amount of time, you have to play, I would argue, by their rules in order to win. That being said, I want to kind of move to the last topic of today, and that's, as it's very well known, the so-called Trump derangement syndrome. Because Trump derangement syndrome is real. I put together a quick montage of headlines and newspaper and magazine covers about Trump over the last couple of years. Yeah, as these pictures show you, right, Trump derangement syndrome is something real. So this idea that Trump is Hitler, that Trump is Mussolini, that Trump will turn the United States into a dictatorship, these ideas are absolutely real on the left. Like, there are many who sincerely believe this, although I think not within the Democratic Party, but I think many over whom the Democratic Party has sway. Now, this, I think, culminated in an article from November 2023 written by Robert Kagan, who, of course, is also the husband of Victoria Nuland, somebody who's responsible probably for some of the most disastrous US foreign policy decisions. And here is what he wrote. For those who cannot see this, let me read it to you. Should Trump be successful in launching a campaign of persecution and the opposition prove powerless to stop it, then the nation will have begun an irreversible descent into dictatorship. With each passing day, it will become harder and more dangerous to stop it by any means, legal or illegal. Now, this is the position of the Washington Post, of Robert Kagan, right? That the closer we get to the election, the harder it will be to stop Donald Trump, either by legal or illegal means. So does it really surprise you? Is it truly a surprise that then somebody might take up the mantle of what Robert Kagan was alluding to and say, well, if he cannot be stopped by legal means, then possibly I have to stop him by illegal means. But I think the other question we have to ask, and this is the thing I want to get into now, is why is it that they hate Donald Trump so much? Because once again, if you look at Donald Trump's biography, it's remarkable. Like, he was well liked both on the left and on the right of the political aisle. He was a guest of honor at Chelsea Clinton's wedding. He donated both to Republicans and to Democrats during his time in New York. So he is not the kind of hardcore right-wing individual you would think, right? I remember during George W. Bush's time, there was this fear that the Republican Party would descend into this Christian nationalist a party, right, where the TV preachers, for example, would take over the party. And then you get Donald Trump, who is nothing of the like. Multiple divorces, somebody who has, let's say, an uneasy relationship with being faithful in his marriages. So not the hardcore religious leading figure you would imagine. So what is it that this actually, in many ways, just one other example, he was for gay marriage before Barack Obama and Joe Biden were for gay marriage. So why exactly did probably one of the most liberal Republicans became this boogeyman for the left? Because I think the reason is something else. And this is, again, something that I believe is true both in Europe and the United States. The dividing lines that we often find are not so much between liberal and conservative or between left-wing and right-wing. I think the true dividing line is between patriotism and those who love their country and those who are, let's call it, either post-patriotic or openly despise their countries. There's a great phrase or a great term coined by Roger Scruton, the late philosopher Roger Scruton, who talked about oikophobia, like fear of your own tradition, fear of your own country. And of course, the opposite concept would be oikophilia, which is kind of the love, the dedication, your loyalty to your own tradition, to your own country. And there is one philosopher I want to talk about here in particular. Now, we talk a lot these days about Karl Marx. And whenever you go to college, everybody needs to know everything about Karl Marx. But I don't think that Karl Marx is the most significant and most influential economist or sociologist or whatever title you want to give him, philosopher of modernity. I think it's an Austrian economist. And bear with me. Not one of the Austrian economists of the free market belief, not von Mises, not Böhm-Bawerk, but somebody else. I'm talking about Joseph Schumpeter. He wrote in the 1940s a fantastic book called Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. Now, what makes Schumpeter such a remarkable author is he believed, like Karl Marx, that capitalism would come to its end and that socialism would ultimately be triumphant. But the interesting part is the way in which he believed that capitalist societies would move towards socialist societies. Because what Schumpeter argued was, it's not going to be the working class who's going to rise up against capitalism, against the capitalist system. Schumpeter says the capitalist system is going to be so successful, it will create, to use at least one Marxist term, it will create such a surplus in wealth, it will create such a surplus in capital, that capitalist societies will have the means for a new class to emerge. And that new class that Schumpeter talks about is the class of what he calls the so-called intellectuals. And Schumpeter then asks, well, you have a very rich society, a society that is wealthy enough to solve most of its problems. So what exactly would these intellectuals then do? What would be the obligation of those intellectuals? And Schumpeter comes to the conclusion that the main persuasion or activity of these intellectuals will then be to attack the system that enabled their existence in the first place. So Schumpeter argues that capitalism will lead to the emergence of an intellectual class, and they find their calling in constantly criticizing and turning against the system that brought them forth in the first place. And I think this is very much what we see today. Right? If you look, for example, at the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel demonstrations, an anti-Israel demonstration, anti-Zionist demonstration is in essence an anti-Western demonstration. Now, why do I say this? Because if you take a close look at these demonstrations, it's not just the waving of Palestinian flag, it's also the trampling or the burning of American flags on American soil. But of course, the same happens in Europe as well. We saw the same during the Euro Championships. For those of you who suffered through watching football, it's the same for the Euro Championship in Germany, right? Where you had left-wing political parties saying we would really ask the fans not to wave German flags, not to show German flags. We saw this recently in an article in The Telegraph. The Telegraph uncovered that in British schools, that they are being asked to teach the history of Great Britain and the United Kingdom in the same way they teach the history of Nazi Germany. So it's not that the British were the good guys and the Nazis the bad guys, it's that everybody who comes from the West is the bad guy. Now, but you see this idea, you see this concept emerging almost exclusively from the intellectual class, precisely how Schumpeter would have predicted it. So this is not a working class phenomenon. Like if you read, which I highly recommend, my friend Batya Ungar-Sargon's most recent publication, her book Second Class, that dives deep into the living reality of the working class. The working class is as patriotic as it has always been, which is one of the reasons why JD Vance, and in this respect I believe he's a good candidate, why JD Vance and Donald Trump resonate with the working class, because they're unapologetically patriotic. But the intellectual class is not, because as Schumpeter has described, they find meaning in turning against the very society that made their existence possible. And we see this both, again, in Europe and we see it in the United States. And I believe this is, in fact, the biggest threats to Western civilization. And as I said in the first episode of this podcast, that is the bigger picture I always want to discuss with you. Are we in a phase of civilizational decline? And what is the nature of that civilizational decline? Because if you look at all the other elements, technology, wealth, medicine, like you can justifiably say that the West is doing very well, right? In many ways, we are still on top. Like the fact that English is still the global language. The fact that I would say worldwide, there's still an admiration for Western art, for Western cuisine, for all these things. So the West is not dead yet. And it's not so much the Chinese or the Russians or the Islamists who are fighting against Western civilization. I think the biggest resistance comes from within Western civilization itself, and that is what Schumpeter has been talking about. I think Schumpeter identified something that Marx is touching upon, but didn't realize as much as Schumpeter did, which is that human beings have an innate need for meaning in their life. But what do you do in a world where almost all material desires can be or are easily satisfied? And Schumpeter says, if you live in a society that has, and I'm quoting here not directly, but that has more or less answered the material, the economic questions, then what's there left to do? Right? If you are the civilization that is on top economically, now you cannot really punch down on the developing countries who are trying to reach the same level. So what's left there? Whom can you be against? It's your own civilization. Now, Francis Fukuyama, somebody who has been heavily criticized for his end of history thesis, but I believe that many people have not actually read maybe the article, but not the book. He makes this very interesting claim towards the end of the book where he says that even if the end of history would appear, there is a very strong chance that people would struggle against the end of history, not because they believe that there is something better on the horizon, but because they struggle for struggle's sake. A similar argument, of course, that Nietzsche would have made. And I think this is a kind of time we live in. So another claim that is often made is that the modern left is nihilistic. And I think there is something to this, something we will explore in greater detail in future episodes. But it's not just a kind of a shrug your shoulder, the world is what it is kind of nihilism. It is a nihilism that demands to be filled. It's a sense of emptiness that demands to be filled. And since we have disqualified nationalism, patriotism, or as I called it before, oikophilia, right? What's left then is oikophobia. So you find your identity, or your modern identity, your postmodern identity, in being against traditional identity, working class identity, whatever you want to call it. And I think this is something we have to talk about and explore in greater detail, because the reason why destructive ideologies are gaining ground in the West is not because these ideologies are in themselves so convincing. I don't think that Islam is a particular, or Islamism, if you will, but I'll leave that up to you, is in itself a very convincing ideology. I don't think that wokeness is in itself a very convincing ideology. But you have nothing to oppose it. It becomes convincing. So the main argument thereby is you cannot beat something with nothing. So if you have nothing to believe in, even the most ridiculous belief system, I believe, to overuse that term, of course, gets a certain power. And I think we see this in all areas of life. And this is, I think, also the problem that I talked about earlier about moderation and radicalization. That the so-called radicals, like they push very hard for something to believe in. And I think very often the moderates, that those who believe in more traditional values, have nothing to put up against this. But this is something I will talk about in greater detail in the shows to come, and I hope you'll join me on this journey. This was the second episode of Hammer Time. Thank you very much for being with me until the end. Please leave comments, send me emails, contact me in whatever way you see fit. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you next week.